All right. Welcome all. Our usual habit has developed into showing a small slideshow and talk about something, and then we open it up for discussion. And when we are using the electronic hand signal, and then that shoots you to the upper left corner, and we know you want to talk and who's after you. So with that, I will share my screen and the slideshow. All right, our intention is to engage in a collaborative exploration of the economic principles and the tools necessary for a regenerative humanity. Your hosts are Tanuja Prasad and myself, Pam Campbell. Our big question is, what might we uncover or devise to move the economic finance systems towards regeneration? This is a huge subject, regenerative economics, but by collaborating together, we may find new ways to help save our planet and our species. Quick review. Last week, Tanuja hosted our continued discussion on Elinor Ostrom's 8 principles for managing the commons as viewed through the complexity lens. And we had started with a New York Times article about the dysfunctional model underlying our current economic theory, and Ostrom's observation that the current economic theory is based on extreme assumptions. And we had a great conversation. Today, we're continuing discussing our paradigm shift from the current economic model to a whole systems regenerative understanding, because we believe that the structures we create today become the infrastructures of tomorrow. So what is regeneration? Regeneration, what we're calling it here, is about ensuring that today's structures will support life in all its range and complexity tomorrow and thereafter. So given that definition, what is regeneration in economic models? And to set the stage, Tanuja found another article in the New York Times, yet another article bemoaning the specter of slowing economic growth combined with rising prices, and even went so far as to state that we do not have a clear answer on how to deal with the situation because we have a lot of things going on at the same time. Imagine that. It's not just inflation that we know how to cure. And when I made the slide, Tanuja said, "Oh, that's so you, Pam." Yes, it's not just one thing, it's complex. And that's what we're needing to grapple with. So Tanuja and I hung out yesterday and we came up with the big monsters, some of the big monsters that are hidden in the current complicated economic storyline. Here are just a few of them. Scarcity. Now that all resources have become scarce, the current model for managing scarce resources can no longer even pretend to provide opportunity for all. Another monster is unexpected sudden change, the pandemic. The current system has no models, no feedback loops, no tools, no levers, at least not ones that are really working. 3, rigidity in the governmental structures. The governmental structures as they stand have an inability to meet emergency needs, and their inherent reliance on economic growth permits undue influence of money and power, which muddies the waters on how to begin to meet emergency situations. And the way it's created, there's a real absence of citizen engagement mechanisms. And this is worldwide. Although I'm most familiar with American ignorance, the general lack of awareness of how our individual behaviors affect the economy, because we're trained as consumers, not citizen participants. And conscious or unconscious reduction, active or passive, in educating us in critical thinking skills. So those are just 4. And we want to start a discussion. As always, we ground our discussions in the knowledge that humans wish well for themselves and for others, and that we want to be talking about solutions and designing structures and tools that allow for that well-wishing to flow. So how might we begin to think about regenerative economic and financial changes? And I added the question, will climate crisis finally move the needle? And that, my friends, is the slideshow this morning. So we want to open it up for your thoughts and discussion on clearly a big subject, but one that we are looking forward to talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. That grounding in climate crisis, or the big question, is really, I think, perhaps the tipping point that will allow us, those who like to think regeneratively, to come to the front of the stage. I think so. Already I have friends who are not in this area now saying they are beginning to understand the reason that our economic model needs to change. So prior to this, they never really thought of the economic model as being a player, as a problem, but now they do. So already that general discussion is coming into the sphere of the general public. That's a big deal. And that is the beginning, in my opinion, of the tipping point. So it is for us now to suggest, create, build new tools and new financial and economic models that can be used when it's needed. Yeah. So I wanted to focus just a little bit on that New York Times article. If you get a chance, please read it. The language that the article uses, it is so based in the assumptions that growth is the only parameter of success and of economic health. So any slowing of growth, forget absence, any slowing of growth is already something to be afraid of. Yeah. So the article, for example, said Chinese economic growth has slowed to 0.4%. And that is now causing panic all around the world. Imagine that. So the question I asked to myself is, life moves in cycles. You know, there are the ups and downs, and we need to respond to situations, the pandemic being one of them. If economic slowing is the way that we respond to a situation like the pandemic, then why are our indicators not able to say that a slowing is correct, or there is no unhealthiness in the underlying system? It is merely responding to the situation. So that's an indicator I would very much like to build. You know.
And Tanuja, could you please put the link into the chat to that article?
I'll do that.
maybe another question is anyone else seeing that talking about needing to make these changes is appearing more in the mainstream media? I'm starting to see a little bit of that. Maybe I'm not very mainstream though. Lisa.
I'm not very mainstream either, so I can't speak to that second question, Pam, but Tanuja, just what you were saying about the cycles, the ebbs and flows really brings us back to, what's inherent in this group and in any of these regenerative ways of being is nature, recognizing nature in ourselves and ourselves in nature and the economic systems that we create. If we're coming from a place of we are nature, there is ebb and flow in life itself. In the harvest, there is ebb and flow. For example, tomatoes look like they're dying right now in Houston, Texas, but they're still bearing fruit. There's a natural life cycle. And so in an economic model that is rooted in nature, wouldn't it be inherently known and felt that there would be an ebb and flow? And growth doesn't always look like tomatoes or vining. Sometimes growth looks different. It's a different part of the life cycle as it's going back to seed and degenerating so that it can rebirth itself again when the season is appropriate.
Mm.
Yeah, very true, very true. I think there's a bit of resistance in the economic world, or let's say the Wall Street world, to think of themselves as being nature. Yeah, I understand that, but so I'm not disagreeing, Lisa. I'm just saying, I'm looking for different language that will convey the same idea to a Wall Street person. So for example, let's say a human being occasionally falls ill, gets a cold, gets a fever, and when they have a fever, they don't go to work. So they take some downtime in order to flow. Now imagine if we said, oh, you are sick for one day, that means your future career has a downward path simply because you were sick for one day. And that's what we're looking at today. All the economies are slowing down because of the pandemic, and now we're saying you're all unhealthy. But here's the crux of it. If we use slowing of growth as an indicator, then people's credit rating, the rate at which they can take loans, I'm talking about the national level, changes. So the more you have slowed down, the more you've been affected by the pandemic, the higher your interest rate is going to be, which means your future is impacted because we don't recognize that ebb and flow nature of the world. Yeah. So I'm trying to pin this down into very Wall Street language.
Mm. I recently took this course on regenerative economics. And it was my big takeaway from the class is that the world is still trying to find solution without having to have upheaval in personal comfort and well-being. And that a ton of energy is going into trying to figure out solutions while maintaining personal wealth. And I just wonder if that's actually going to be possible in the end. and I'm in the world of philanthropy, and that this is endemic to that space as well. People will only give provided it helps their personal wealth, and it doesn't, they won't give to projects that will, if they think they will ultimately upset their personal wealth. And these are the drivers that are occurring, and we all participate. We all participate in that. So
that's, Pam, it's important, because if there is a natural ebb and flow, but we're always trying to remain the same, that's kind of what you're saying, is that we deal with situations without ever having to take any personal hit, then what we're doing is we're pushing the negatives. We're pushing the negatives to the people who are less powerful,
yeah.
and into the commons.
And what do we call that in complexity science?
It's called separation between two poles. It's
okay.
Yeah. So the commons are often, nature, the commons, the world, all that is often portrayed as female. So it is the
Other.
separation as other, yes, separation between the masculine and the
Mother Nature.
Exactly. And so we're pushing it in that direction. We're saying, I don't want to take a hit. Yeah. It needs to be taken care of. The same thing's happening with the climate crisis right now. The corporations are saying, well, I don't need to take the hit. Let others do it. Or they're saying, I don't need to be the first to take a hit. You see? So people are, the large corporations, especially Wall Street, are playing a waiting game. There's a lot of discussion in the media on why things are so slow to change. That's one of the reasons. It's not that they are not intelligent people on Wall Street. Yeah. It's more that they're waiting to see if this is real, what shape it'll take, where the risks lie, and where the profits are. So everybody will run towards the profits and push the losses away from themselves. So I do think that this rise of social entrepreneurship is important, very important, because it's a model that can take on these risky things and still be considered so-called, in quotes. So please don't criticize me for this bit. Still be considered cool, valuable, worthy, etc.
Within the current paradigm.
Within the current paradigm. That's right. And I'm hoping that social entrepreneurship, once it catches on, it becomes the normal way of doing business, so that all the indicators then shift and include the parameters of social entrepreneurship. Yeah. Yes, Trisha.
Thanks so much. Thanks for this discussion and just raising social entrepreneurship, and also raising the field of philanthropy kind of brings up a lot of questions for me around, because what I have seen and what I've experienced is that within, for instance, within social entrepreneurship, we're still working within a capitalist system. So what then happens is, if I'm doing social benefit work, I actually can't make those numbers work within a social entrepreneur framework, right? I can't make a balance sheet work out, because what I'm doing doesn't fit into the capitalist structure. And then I also feel that there's assumptions that are kind of underlying things when in regards to, like, impact investing or philanthropy, where it's still like, who is deciding, right? And who decides who decides? And inevitably, what seems to happen is that the decision makers are outside of the communities of impact, when it's actually the people inside of the community of impact that know what they need, and that already have things figured out. What they're lacking is the resources to carry those things out. So I understand there's the need to change kind of the ideation within Wall Street lingo, but I also believe actually there's the need to change it even within the field of regeneration, in that, like, who is kind of developing the frameworks, who are the people that are getting the first sources of funding, how do we bring the voices from the most grassroots, and how do we elevate them to a level that those frameworks that they're operating in can be upheld. And I know I'm feeling a little pessimistic in a way here, but just to kind of add in that, you know, like COVID has been kind of this perfect opportunity for us to wake up in a way, right? I mean, we can also just look at essential workers, and just the term itself, essential workers, shows us actually where our values are, but also economically where our values are not. So I'll just stop there. Those are just the thoughts that came to mind for me as a result of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tricia. But you know what you're outlining? The idea that social entrepreneurs are operating in a current context. And the current context is not understanding, is making the judgments, is not shifting. You know, this is a classic complexity problem, because it is a context with a new player coming in. The new players are not the dominant players yet. What do they do? The parameters are still the old parameters. In fact, that is the reason that I went into complexity science, because I didn't think that the foundational theories, economic and otherwise, could handle the future. So I went and looking for a new one. But this is a classic sort of a, which chicken and egg, which comes first, which comes second problem. But the way, I mean, this is not the first time this problem has been faced. The way to move forward, in my opinion, please suggest otherwise, is not to approach it as a single fractal problem, rather to come at it from different angles, to make a small incremental step in every area, the theory, the media, the financial models, the indicators. Make a step in all of those areas, so that all of those incremental steps create a systemic movement, a systemic change. Because if we try to move single factors, go to the VCs and say, listen, you don't understand me, here's what we need, that will not work, because the VCs are themselves swimming in a context that doesn't have the necessary tools and necessary underlying models. Yeah. And I'm hoping that's what this diverse group can help us do, is you take these ideas, these discussions back to your work and make one small step. Talk about it, write about it, make that one small step. So, Yangbo.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. But Yangbo, would you also speak a little bit to what you said earlier in the chat about time travel and the comment from Tom, what was his name? Thomas.
Thomas Sedlacek, yes.
Yeah.
That really fundamentally, it really strikes at the, and put it up there, the merge, because it fundamentally strikes at what even the purpose of finance is, because I see so many people treating finance as something complicated and such, and I keep pushing back saying, no, it's not something that's so complicated. You can just defer to those on Wall Street or elsewhere about this. But as long as you remember that what you're doing, say with credit or debt, it basically allows you, let's say you want, assuming that, let's say you suppose that your future is going to be wealthier than your present. So, well, what if you want that future today? What if you want to feel so prosperous today that you can't wait until that future? So you borrow against it. Technically, that's credit right there. You borrow against it so you can feel as rich as you would be in the future today. But on the other hand, well, that means then that wealth is no longer available when that moment hits. Well, you still want to keep it up. Let's say you fast forward to that future period. Well, you're still expecting to be wealthier, yet you don't have that wealth any longer. So you borrow again against that future. So you basically, you just keep borrowing. So hence, if you just to drive to the logical conclusion, that growth, really the primary purpose that you even need growth in any type of an economic system, everything else being equal, the only purpose that you need growth, at least in that type of a toy model of trading off between your present and future selves, is you're expecting to have greater and greater quantities of credit and debt, which by definition, debt is just a claim on future production, claim on future wealth. And if you claim more and more future wealth, of course, you're going to have to grow much more in order to fulfill those claims fundamentally.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
exactly right, Yang. Thank you for giving that example. That's exactly right.
That's a great, clear explanation, actually. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, and Artie. Oh, I'm sorry, Tanuja, did you want to comment?
Yeah, Artie, if I could give another example before you take the stage. Yangbo, what you have described is exactly what happened in the years 1999, 2000, when the tech bubble burst. If folks remember that. The late 90s was a period of enormous tech growth, in the sense that, not in the sense of big companies like Apple, but in the sense that all the companies, the small companies, were starting to understand and implement tech in their workflows. That included office tech like Microsoft Office tools and printers and all that. So the buying boom happened then, and people, the tech sector, assumed that the buying boom would continue. So they borrowed off of that. And then the whole thing collapsed.
Honestly, even better example to just before RT comes in would be, and this is very salient because there's so much echoing and rhyming, if not exactly repeating, of what was going on in the late 1980s vis-a-vis Japan then with mainland China today, because with so much of the coverage there, especially in recent decades, what I'm finding is, and honestly, even Ray Dalio himself, I'm finding is somewhat, hope he's changing his assumptions, because he did seem somewhat blind to this when he was basically writing about how China, how they're going to be a rising superpower and such. And yet when we dig more closely, at least from my judgment, I don't see anything, at least as of yet, that could convince anyone that this is not a rhyme, if not a repeat, of Japan circa 1990.
Interesting. Very interesting.
With worse
and it makes sense, because
exactly.
What do you do when you do the same thing? You get the same outcome.
With even less favorable demographics than what was then, even less favorable demographics. So fundamentally, I just find, why are so many seemingly flying blind about this? That are they expecting to be able to cash out right before the whole thing just crumbles?
Yeah.
All right. I want to let Artie.
That chicken game is really scary. It's really scary because we now have people, the intelligent people, the graduates from our top universities playing the chicken game against people who are less powerful.
Oh,
Rather
time
than leading,
buying the dip, all those, yeah.
yes, rather than leading the thought and the effort to create a more more friendly world, they're trying to just be first. They're just trying to be first. And in fact, they're doing exactly what our definition of regeneration says. They're doing exactly not that. You know, if we're saying that the structures of today becomes the infrastructure of tomorrow, what they're saying is all I care about is the structures of today. I don't care that you then have to deal with my footprint. It's not just carbon footprint, right? It's my thought footprint, it's my physical footprint, it's my economic, all of that counts. Yeah. So Aarti, finally.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on a few things: debt, social entrepreneurship, and I think one thing that is really important for me is sort of differentiating between our wants and our needs, and also sort of products and services. So I have a very concrete social entrepreneurship example from South Africa, where because of a lack of government services in early childhood development, so here the product is going to be a 5-year-old, okay? But because the government doesn't fund early childhood development sufficiently, and we all know that the first few years of any person's life are the most formative, you have a lot of typically women setting up play schools, day centers, so that guardians can leave the children somewhere while they go off to work. Now, what this organization has done is it's created a highly protocolized way for getting the women to both have stable businesses and provide quality education. But the nonprofit actually puts in the equivalent of around 100,000, well, around 100,000 Rand in terms of physical infrastructure and mentoring over a 5-year period. So they're mentoring the school owner, they're developing the teachers, they're getting the parents to engage, and I think what so what started as a sort of purely sort of philanthropic model became then, okay, we're now going to, half of that money, 50,000 Rand, is now going to be given to you as a loan, which you pay back over a 5-year period, because until now, the school owners were only paying a sort of small fee to this nonprofit every month. And the idea was that, you know, if you have a loan, you're going to feel incentivized to keep, you know, getting fees for the children, and being, you know, have careful about accounting for your expenses and so on and so forth. So yes, it is a sort of profit and loss, you know, money in, money out model. But the point is that, you know, without that, you're not going to end up with 5-year-olds who have the level of skills, age appropriate skills, to go and continue having an education. So I think, you know, it's not always about physical goods that we don't need. It is about an education that we want. Yeah. So.
Very important, Aarti. It's not just about avoiding things. It's also about wanting things. It's the direction that we go.
Well, and needing education versus stuff that we want, I think is also, you know, recognizing that. But you can't talk about a nonprofit supplying funding without dragging behind it, as we know from complexity science, all of the harm that's done in producing the donation, in producing the money that is the real heart of what we're talking about. And one second, Colleen, I want, the problem with the Western economic model that we use is that we get to bracket and then look at outcomes within a bracketed arena. And by doing that, by ignoring all of the negative externalities that are created, you can look at it and say, oh, I'm doing good, but you don't have a real accounting until you add and subtract all of the externalities that are that go into creating that. And that's, to me, what I love about complexity science and what is the inherent flaw in the current system is what I just said. So
Yeah, completely.
that's what we
And
need to do. We need to get proper accounting. If we're going to stick with accounting, then we need to have proper accounting that really takes everything into account in determining if something is a plus or a negative. But that is next to impossible to do. So, yeah.
yeah, there was a question in the chat by, I think it was Lisa, who asked, are there any feedback loops that could be introduced into our current system? And in fact, that is some of the questions we're asking you, is are there small changes that could be made that can move everything towards regeneration? And to Pam's point, you see, I believe in the power of information, regardless of who agrees with it or not. If someone just did the accounting of one Wall Street bank, one, and said, if I look at the first generation, second generation impacts, and I account for them, this is what their profit was. Not, $20 billion as they stated, but rather minus 20 billion. And just put it out there. That's it. Just put it out there. Let other people criticize it. It doesn't matter. That's the way. So just one quick comment about how we measure ourselves, how we met by ourselves, I mean companies. So right now, if you go to, let's say a mutual fund or something like that, what they called market rate returns, quote, market rate returns. What are market rate returns? They are the ROI of the companies who are doing business as usual. That is our standard against which we're measuring all new businesses, all social enterprises. Every effort is being measured against that. But that's like saying, if I measure my rate of return based on the drug dealer in my neighborhood and say, I want the same rate of return as my drug dealer. And that's what we're doing here. So the concept of market rate returns itself is that flawed.
Yep. All right. We're going to Colleen.
Well, as I'm listening to all of this, it reminds me of a really complicated chart that I saw once. It shows the global marketplace, and all the producers and all the transportation and all this crazy thing. And then by contrast, we saw, kind of a localized economic model of just a single community and how everything was kind of in a circle and much simpler. And I as I look at our global economic situations and I recognize in my own how many of the things that surround me are not made anywhere close to me. My desk was made in China, and I'm eating pineapples from the Philippines, and I'm doing all this kinds of stuff. And yet I really think the experiment that we're doing in our communities is relocalization. And if we relocalize our economies based on essential needs first, let's make sure everybody can eat. let's make sure that people know each other well enough to know if someone is not being ethical about the way they're responding, to the community or whatever. So in a small community, everybody kind of knows everybody. And so the unethical behavior becomes apparent rather rapidly. Whereas in a global economy, you can have bad actors that go on and make a great deal of money and nobody can hold them to account. So I think maybe the relocalization, first of all, we think about, what are basic needs that people have of food and clothing and shelter and things of that nature. And we start rebuilding local economies based on creating abundance in those basic things. Then we trade out of our abundance rather than out of our need. And I really wonder if that isn't something that each one of us can do. Because part of the problem is that when we talk about theory, is that it's out there somewhere. It's not anything that I can do personally. I can't be responsible for what's going on over in Malaysia. I hate what's going on over there. They're like taking out all the forests and they're killing the animals, and I hate that. But what can I personally do about that? Other than to have a strong opinion about it. But I think that if we start buying locally, just make sure that our neighbors have enough to eat and that they have what's required. Then when we trade out of abundance instead of out of need. And I think that changes a lot. And I don't, all I can say is that if we can do that and start trading out of abundance rather than out of need, maybe it shows other people how to do that. Because I think cities, honestly, people are a problem. Can we agree on that? People are problematic. You have a whole bunch of people, you stick them in the city, millions of people in a city, and it's like, oh my gosh, they can't feed themselves, they can't clothe themselves, that they're sitting in front of computers all day, or they're building buildings, or they're fixing the sewer systems, or they're doing all this kinds of stuff, but none of it's feeding anybody. And you've got this whole huge ecosystem of people that need food. So yeah, I mean, it's, and then, as a result of all these people in the city needing food, then you have to automate all of the countryside in order to feed them. Whereas if we just take people out of the city and have gardens, everybody's got a garden now. And you don't have to have all this automation in the countryside anymore. So yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of things to think about. And so I'm all for relocalizing.
Yeah, thank you.
That solves a lot of trouble.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, for sure. Michael, please, how are you today?
Hello, I'm well. Thank you. I'm trying to decide which thread to pick up in which conversation, but I'll start with my agreement with Colleen and my disagreement. I hear a clear sense of need to do something, which I share. And rather than assume that the cities are the problem and the countryside is where the answers are, I have found the idea of simplification as being a unifying thing for both those camps, if you will, simplifying life, simplifying one's relationship. So I choose to stand there instead of in that binary. The thing that I was going to say, complexity, how to even put lines around it. And this is a perfect example, right? We each have opinions about how to frame. As I was listening to folks talk about economics, I was trained as an economist, so I tend to have a different vocabulary than your average person about economics. And there are things that use the word economics that are everything that humans are involved in and the system of human stuff. And then there's and I seem to hear that in this conversation, the financialized marketplace in a sense, and how it's the source of all the transacting and this, that, and the other. And when I think of regenerative economics, I'm thinking of the whole, the bigger, rather than strictly assuming that if we get the financialized spaces resolved, then we've resolved everything. There is a lesson from the financialized spaces that I think points to where you were going, Tanuja, your suggestion about measurement. And that is, it wasn't always that we had financial accounting books. It's a relatively recent phenomenon in human history that people know how much money the Treasury had or whatever. And so there's been a revolution in tracking financial activity. And now we're all kind of assuming, just like everybody's trying to be like physics, physics figured out a whole dimension of science. And so all the social scientists are trying to be like physicists. There's kind of a little bit of that going on in the impact targeting and impact and results delivery space, that if we just do it as the financialized tribe has done it, then and it's a little bit more than that, because money is money, and it's sort of a fungible exchange of value, but sometimes we can conflate everything and lose what might be hidden in plain sight. One of the things that has helped me kind of break out of the growth degrowth thing has been, I tend to think of, and I've used this, by the way, and it could be an experiment in which I might invite, if others are interested, I'm not sure if I really want to do this or not, but about, I guess 5-10 years ago now, I was doing a project for the World Bank where we were looking at investments in incubators and whether or not they were returning results. And the bank was happy to receive results that showed number of jobs coming out of these investments in incubators, how many people were getting extra jobs or not, and that was the expected measurement. And the bank isn't about making money, the World Bank, it's about showing results, but still it was a financialized. So I kind of, in a surreptitious way, it's like, I'm going to canvas the portfolios, about 200 projects in 4 different countries, and group them into 4 classes. Instead of number of jobs produced, I'm going to take financial impact. Are they growing or shrinking? Happiness, because that's something that I cared about, growing or shrinking. And then since then, I've added this whole environment, growing and shrinking. And what I found that simple model enabled me to do was to talk to people on the street that didn't care about my specialized vocabulary. And they could tell me what their project was doing, whether it was a people thing, a money thing, or a natural thing foremost, and then whether they were growing the good or shrinking the bad. It was a way of thinking about it. And that alone enabled a kind of a quantification of things that prior to that were only represented through financial metrics. And all of a sudden we could see that, for example, in South Africa, that of the 4 countries, and South Africa was one of the 4 countries that were looked at, that they were much more diverse in how they were investing their funding than Senegal, who was putting almost all of it into what we would call classic economic return kind of investments. And why am I going through this whole? Because even when people want to, do the right thing, if they don't have visibility, they just keep on, they feed the machine in the direction it's going, and they just keep on going. And it turns out that it was possible to begin to show, to add extra, if you will, labels to what was, everything was reported financially, to put on these kind of, are you growing environment, shrinking human footprint, or pretty easily. And that enabled then for portfolio level viewing, in other words, meta consciousness, to begin to think differently about how to invest or not invest. And, this was a prototype, showed that it worked. Then the thing is, of course, replicating and scaling. And it turns out that this could serve not just world bankers, but a whole variety of different actors. If the way in which they're monitoring the systems made it easier for them to see good, bad, and which swim lanes. I know I kind of went off on a tangent there, but I see this problem as kind of an information. What are the mental models that we're using to decide and operate in the world? And we have defaulted, we've given sovereignty to the financial language. And it was invented not that long ago either. And we can just keep evolving. So that's my little rant. I'm sorry I took up so much time.
Not at all, Michael. Actually, what you've done is you've highlighted one possible way forward. It is actually, okay, so I'm from technology, from IT, sorry, folks. From a technical and IT perspective, this is actually very easy, because you take a database of data. It could be financial returns. Let's say you have a simple database, company financial return. That's it. Add a few columns to that and say a human footprint, et cetera, and just add them. That's it. Even if those are not being used currently in the current models, adding them creates a level of transparency. Then the next step would be, okay, what indicators could we build to use those additional pieces of information? Second would be, how could we build feedback loops around it, and so on. That is a way forward, instead of saying we need to break everything that currently exists and then start over, right? But where we do need to start over is in the foundational theory. So we do need to get rid of the reductionist theory. So, yeah.
Boy, so much to take in, so many good threads. I figured as much with the broad questions that we started the morning with, and tons of good references in the chat for sure. So make sure that you save the chat as we begin to wrap up here. So that, and please, anybody who wants to add anything else for people to check out. We have taken on a huge challenge, and unfortunately it is what is called for at this time. I really believe that we are in a paradigm shift. It is underway, and we are moving from humans having dominion over the earth and nature to humans are a part of the whole natural system. That's what we're moving through. I think we're probably 50, 60 years in. I believe it began when the Apollo spaceship sent back that picture of that beautiful little blue marble, and we got to see ourselves in our wholeness really for the first time. And that ever since then, there has been an awakening. And as we've scarfed up all of the natural resources, it's all coming together and forcing us into living life differently. And I hope that we use natural law, natural systems as our guide as we begin to really think about, as we evolve. as Michael said. We can continue to evolve. And I believe that there is my positive attitude. I believe we can evolve.
Yeah. And let me reiterate, our intention here is to co-create through collaboration of this kind of diverse community, a potential new set of tools, solutions, steps together that we could put out there. It could be an article, it could be an indicator, it could be anything out there. So if
Bring
anybody's
things
interested,
to share.
keep it in your mind, keep it going, and one day we will come together and put something out there.
Have a aha. Somebody
Yeah.
somewhere will eventually have an aha that will actually begin the shift, and may it not be a true tragedy. So
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, guys, thank you ever so much for joining us. Come back again next Tuesday and have a great time in between.